I've always believed that a person's intelligence can be measured by their own understanding or comprehension of what they don't know. So by that measure, I'm a certified genius, as I am confidently 100% certain about almost nothing in this world. And in fact, I am not even certain about that maxim, of course. In fact, it's clearly not true. But I'm sure you might agree that it feels like it should be true, like what goes around comes around, never go to bed angry, or women and children first. Nonetheless, these canards, or perceived truisms, are popular because they seem fair and just, despite the near certainty that the universe is anything but. This is because whether we're willing to acknowledge it or not, each of us is in a constant internal struggle between the feels and the reals. In fact, I've always been wary of people who claim to only act on logic and reason. Such is their ignorance of the role of their own emotions in decision-making. We all do it. Another thing I believe we all do, to different extents and to different purposes, is pine for a better world. The worst person you know, who might sit on the total opposite of the political spectrum to you, whatever it may be, genuinely thinks that their vision of the world is an overall better and fairer one than yours. Donald Trump genuinely thinks he can solve all the world's problems if we just let him do whatever he wants. Whether he is right or wrong is a completely different conversation and irrelevant to my point. There is an idealist in all of us, however small, and as a society we tell people, especially young people, that such thinking is naive and untethered from reality. But that would be an easier pill to swallow had we not, at various points in history, especially in the second half of the 20th century, come tantalizingly close to achieving at least some kind of idealist vision, or at least elements of it. Whether there's truth in it or not, the attention economy demands that we are constantly bombarded with information, reiterating again and again that everything is terrible and things can only get worse. And there is some truth to that, of course. But those of us old enough to remember life basically before the global financial crash of 2008 know that managed decline hasn't always necessarily been the unavoidable reality of modern life, in Europe and North America especially. And aside from the post-war consensus, in the West at least, delivering a higher standard of living for millions and millions of people never before seen by humanity, it's interesting and more than a bit terrifying that the accompanying progress we saw throughout the 20th century, firstly for women, then for people of colour, and then gay people, represented an admirable, if imperfect, peak from which we are now on the downward slide. So far, most noticeably in America, yes. The overturning of Roe versus Wade is a genuinely backward step for women's rights, and the increasing militarization of a police force that statistically targets people of colour disproportionately are very real things, whether they affect you or me directly or not. And the rest of us in the global north are not far behind similar phenomenons in our respective societies, insofar as we're being primed for similar backward steps. And it's not a coincidence that the social regression we're seeing now also comes alongside an economic regression, because of course economics underpin everything. Now there's a certainty for you. For all their perfectly understandable faults and failures, the boomer generation, through a combination of their material advantages, to which I do not begrudge them, and their once youthful idealism, did to an impressive degree break them free from the chains of their parents' generation and make some incredible forward strides in the process. And alongside this economic and social progress, it's not a coincidence that the third horseman of the apocalypse, culture itself, also reflected this. And that's why there are people like me, born far later, who will always look back on that time with a slightly jealous, slightly misguided perhaps, misty-eyed admiration. So if we dare to narrow our focus onto culture specifically, I ask you, could there really be a single event that at least symbolises this cultural high-water mark more than the Woodstock Festival of 1969? And I stress symbolises because, like anything, the reality of it was pretty shoddy. Several people died during the event. I imagine the music probably sounded pretty shit for the majority of attendees, and everyone there was cold, wet, hungry, thirsty, caked in mud, and probably dying for a shit. But it's hard to deny Woodstock as a significant moment, not just for the hippie counterculture, but moreover for the brand of liberalism that then went on to steer Western society for the next 20, 30 or 40 years. Did it end with Reagan and Thatcher, 9/11 or the global financial crash? I don't know. And maybe it hasn't entirely ended at all, at least in some ways. In my student poverty days, my bandmates and I used to endlessly repeat watch 1994's Woodstock Diaries documentary on VHS. Remember those? And of all the performances featured in it, many of them the same as featured in the official 1970 Woodstock film, which I've never actually seen, there was always one that stood head and shoulders above the rest. While of course Hendrix and The Who did turn in iconic if less than career best sets at Woodstock, anyone paying attention will tell you that it was none other than Sly and the Family Stone who really brought the house down at Woodstock. Not just because they far outplayed everyone else there, which they definitely did, but because Sly and the Family Stone themselves represented all of the inclusivity, positivity, and pure musical joy that the counterculture was supposed to represent at that time, on paper at least. In the context of the politically tumultuous late 60s, they in fact went further, beyond the concepts of racial and sexual equality, instead positing a post-race, post-gender future entirely, one that we never, of course, actually achieved. And in that sense, they were far too radical even for 1969, and indeed, they're too radical for today. So this won't be very interesting to you, but as you might expect, I have a long list of albums I intend to cover for this channel, and I perhaps put a little too much thought into making sure from video to video I am jumping across the decades, at least a bit, and that I mostly alternate between American and British artists. And someone close to me suggested I discuss a Joni Mitchell album to ensure this channel wasn't just a big old sausage fest, which I of course was happy to do because I love Joni. But what about black music? Most of the music I grew up listening to, quite naturally I suppose, was for the most part made by white people. This channel, of course, is all about lionizing what I consider the golden age of record making that I've described previously from the 1960s through to roughly the millennium. And post-50s black music, especially soul music, a fairly nebulous term in and of itself, is obviously a big part of that and a major part, if not the major part, of the story of modern popular song. After all, let's face it, more people in the world know who Michael Jackson is than anyone else you or I could possibly name in the music world, and with good reason. Now I know my Motown from my Stax from my Philly soul as well as just about anyone, but shamefully through my inadvertent rockist lens, soul music is filed away in my mind as an alternate, sometimes parallel, sometimes intersecting, but nonetheless distinctive movement that I only partly have access to culturally. And yes, part of that is because I'm indeed a white guy. But moreover, I don't consider myself qualified to comment on black music for the most part, simply because I don't know its various genres as intimately. Of course, it's not lost on me also that the white music that I admittedly mostly specialize in, of course, has its origins in black music anyway, and in many ways I firmly believe we have culturally come full circle, in that rock as we know it is well and truly dead, whereas contemporary black music, whether operating in pop or rap, is the only music in the mainstream that's actually continuing to innovate and push forward into new territory, or at least that was the case last time I checked. I'm specifically referring to the likes of Kanye West throughout the noughties, before he lost his mind obviously, and Kendrick Lamar from around 2012 onwards. That's obviously just the tip of the iceberg, but I'm willing to admit I don't particularly keep my ear to the ground these days, regardless of genre. I'm getting old. However, with all of that said and my rather tokenistic excuses set aside, Sly and the Family Stone, the subject of this video, as I say, is on paper at least, not even black music. It's people music, for everybody. It's everyday people music. See what I did there? In my Joni Mitchell episode, I talked about how her gender and the subject of feminism is not necessarily useful or important in analysing her artistry, although it is also, paradoxically, unavoidable because of her time and place. Similarly, while race is of course crucial to telling the story of Sly and the Family Stone, being a black man is of course not all of what Sly Stone was and is, just as anyone's race is not their entire identity, which was, at least initially, the whole point of Sly and the Family Stone as a band. I think what makes them far more interesting, outside of some incredible music of course, is how their rise and fall actually says more about the hippie generation and the idealism that represented, rather than what it says about American racial dynamics. This band epitomized a futuristic, post-race vision of the world and mirrored the counterculture's euphoric rise and crushing fall as their admittedly admirable ambitions collided brutally with reality, and the trappings of fame destroyed everything that was so vital and pioneering about them. As Oscar Wilde said, there are two tragedies in life. The first is not getting what you want, and the second is getting it. So what do you do in 1969 once you've quote-unquote defeated the forces of evil in racism, inequality and war or whatever? What do you do when you've made it to the top of the mountain after years of toiling in obscurity, suddenly making millions of dollars and everybody telling you that you're a genius? You celebrate. That's what you do. You turn all of that outward-facing energy inward, and that is when the darkness sets in. I've always compared the golden age of record making to the golden age of cinema. There is good stuff being made before and after it, but the era itself is considered a high watermark because the industry at this time was large and prosperous enough to push otherwise unlikely and sometimes bizarre cultural artifacts into the popular consciousness. In music specifically, I would argue that so many of the best albums ever made came out in the 70s specifically because it was a decade where indulgence was not just tolerated, but encouraged. But the optimism symbolized by Woodstock and man first walking on the moon that same year quickly gave way instead to harder drugs, harder music, and all-round harder living in the 70s. As the new decade dawned, and with it the realization that Richard Nixon and the Vietnam War were here to stay, the civil rights and hippie movement stood at a crossroads. Either embrace political violence, therefore putting your own liberty and in many cases your own life on the line for the cause, or do the far easier thing. Ignore all that bad stuff and keep partying. And on top of that, if by that time, riding on this cultural wave of optimism had also in the process made you rich and successful beyond your wildest dreams, and you just happen to be a musical genius like Sly Stone as well, then turning on, tuning in, and dropping out sounds like a pretty good deal. In all honesty, if this humble YouTube channel inexplicably made me into a multi-millionaire overnight, you would be watching an empty screen right now. In a heartbeat, I would buy a music studio and fill it with enough toys and drugs to keep me going forever, indulging every creative whim, building a musical ark to sail away on and having a blast while doing it. And this is exactly what Sly Stone did with his success in the 70s, because this is what real musicians deeply down want for the most part. Fame and attention are symptoms of success, yes, but deep down it's being given the material wherewithal and therefore the permission to indulge yourself that drives a lot of creative people. And of course, were this happen to me, I'm sure it would also all blow up in my stupid face, just as it did for Sly. Because yet another symptom of success is temptation. And ultimately, kids, drugs are no good for you. They might take you to where you think you want to go, but on the way they will drive away your family, your friends, your band, and eventually your talent, if not your actual life. So by 1973, Sly Stone was exactly at this point. His superhuman talent was all he had left of these things. The adage that a black person needs to be twice as good as their white counterparts had gotten him to the top and given him license to be as indulgent as he wanted. And while I will talk about the negative aspects of his character, that is simply because his lifestyle 100% informs and explains the music on 1973's Fresh. A musical and thematic misnomer, if I ever heard one. And it's so easy to fall into the trap of thinking we need to desire or emulate or admire the person behind the art. Perhaps because Sly and the Family Stone and their 1969 Woodstock era peak reflected our cultural and social optimism back at us and made us feel good about ourselves. But Fresh goes far beyond that. Not just because the hippie ideal crumbled, but because a true artist doesn't tell us what we want to hear. They instead bring us into their world, show us an insight into something we didn't already know or expect. And Fresh is proof that there was, at least in that moment, still plenty of juice left in Sly's creative tank, seemingly. But what he didn't know at the time, nor did his fans, was that this was the last time he would make anything even remotely good musically. Like Icarus, Sly Stone immediately went on to crash and burn. But I would say Fresh is the closest he ever got to the sun. A creative high point, perhaps if not for the band itself, then certainly for the man behind the band. Born in Texas in 1943, but raised in Vallejo within the San Francisco Bay Area, Sylvester Sly Stewart was the second of 5 children born into a deeply religious and musical family, with him and his siblings taking to performing as a group in different combinations from early on. A musical prodigy, he quickly mastered several instruments and learned to read and write music, attending Vallejo's only mixed-race high school, where he joined several different bands. Struck by his father's own anti-white racism, a natural byproduct of his tough Southern background, Sly early on made it his business to approach life beyond the confines of race, including developing a love of country music and rock and roll, alongside the jazz and gospel of his upbringing. After studying music formally at community college, he landed his first gig as a DJ for San Francisco soul station KSOL, where he took to mixing in Beatles and Rolling Stones 45s into his playlists. A pioneer even then, Sly became known for integrating the hipster slang of comic Lord Buckley into his between-song monologues, and actually bringing a keyboard into the studio to demonstrate compositional elements of the records as he played and critiqued them. At the same time, he garnered a formidable reputation as a record producer and session musician for Autumn Records, particularly in the genre now known as garage rock. He is responsible for a number of Nuggets-era classics from San Francisco-based groups such as the Beau Brummels and the Mojo Men, as well as producing the original version of White Rabbit by the Great Society, the band that later effectively became Jefferson Airplane. In fact, that song's composer, Grace Slick, has claimed that Sly in fact played every instrument on the track himself, as the band wasn't up to scratch at the time. He pulled together the original version of Sly and the Family Stone in late 1966, initially as a party band doing top 40 hits. Sly was joined by existing collaborators and friends, saxophonist Jerry Martini and trumpet player Cynthia Robinson, plus the standout members of his brother Freddie's band, in drummer Greg Errico and Fred Stone himself on guitar, plus Texan-based playing visionary Larry Graham, who was also Cynthia Robinson's cousin. While guitarist Freddie, and joining slightly later, keyboardist Rose Stone were at least initially Sly's only actual siblings in the group, the rest of the band was in the habit of describing themselves to literally be of the same family. And that speaks to their whole initial ethos as a mixed-race, mixed-gender band, combining the tidy discipline of the soul and R&B review with the scuzzy weirdness of psychedelic garage rock. For my money, it's the group's reliance more on the former than the latter that explains the commercial failure of their debut album, A Whole New Thing, released in October 1967 on CBS's Epic Records label. Stylistically, I would describe it as slightly weird soul, which probably prevented it from being the crossover hit that the band was hoping to deliver. Despite its lauded critical reputation, at least at time of release, I'm not particularly in love with it as an album outside of each side's opening tracks, which in all fairness make A Whole New Thing worth the price of admission alone. And those tracks specifically reveal Sly and the Family Stone's secret sauce, which I would say, at least initially, was drummer Greg Errico. For those interested in music production, drums are everything. The easiest way to date a piece of music is through the drum sound, as methods of miking and mixing drums over the decades have gone through very specific changes that are quite easy to hear if you know what to listen for. And 1967 is a pretty early time in either soul or rock for a drum sound to be this punchy and clear, which is to say, a fat, present-sounding kick drum and a tight snare that just cuts through the mix. While as producer, Sly was clearly sensitive to its importance as the backbone of the group's sound, Greg Errico himself deserves all the credit because he is clearly playing this way very deliberately, perhaps in the tradition of James Brown drummers Clyde Stubblefield and Jacko Starks, Bernard Purdie and Stax's Al Jackson Jr., because more than just his sound, it's his choice of parts. So Underdog, A Whole New Thing's first track and a song Sly had previously given to the Beau Brummels, and for the record, their version is laughably inferior, is an absolute banger, and an unbelievable album and career opener for Sly and the Family Stone, showcasing the horn section, group vocals, and the relentless funk of the rhythm section. Specifically, it's the way that Greg Errico pauses his drum part before dropping it back in on the fourth beat of the bar, just like a DJ might do.
Know how it feels, expect to get a fair share, but they won't let you forget you're the underdog, and you gotta be twice as good. Yeah, yeah.
His playing on this track alone explains why Sly and the Family Stone were later on so heavily sampled by the first generation of hip-hop producers. It's full and it's funky, almost as if it was deliberately designed to be sampled. Side 2's opener, I Cannot Make It, is also another 10 out of 10, and one I'm pretty sure I first heard as a sample in someone else's track. And then finally, LL Cool J famously looped the first few seconds of Trip to Your Heart from this album as well, a song that is interesting if not outstanding compared to those other two. But sadly, well before this became part of their wider legacy, their debut album bombed and a crushed Sly found himself back at the drawing board. With urging from label executive Clive Davis to go more commercial, the band relented with the track Dance to the Music and an album of the same name. A record the band itself hated and saw as a complete sellout, which nonetheless gave them the hit single they needed to launch their career proper. And while it is great for what it is, I can't help but understand why they felt that way. Almost every song on Dance to the Music is a rather simplistic, four on the floor, Motown-y style rave up, including the instructive lyrics, dance to the music, dance to the medley, ride the rhythm. The medley rightly became a staple of their live sets, and the track Are You Ready is iconic, but more importantly, a classic Sly and the Family Stone musical motif, which they developed on this record, and is also heard on the slightly less successful long player 1968 follow-up Life, is the a cappella vocal breakdown. Apparently the result of an accident in rehearsal where Sly forgot the lyrics to a song and started busking nonsensical vocals. Freddie and Larry joined in, and the a cappella vocal breakdown became a feature, a staple even, of many of their biggest tunes. Not only did Freddie and Larry share lead vocals on many tracks, Rose Stone's gospel-inspired co-leads that kind of complement the lead vocals in their songs really cemented Sly and the Family Stone's sound as a group. Goes to show what you can do with a band where nearly every member is a top-rate singer and a top-rate instrumentalist. The talent within this group was just explosive. And alongside those musical motifs in their songs, their stage presentation is where they really shined and would not have been possible were it not for their soul and R&B lineage. This included building up anticipation by having each member of the band walk out on stage separately to pick up their instrument one after the other in the style of King Curtis's Memphis Soul Stew, if you know that song. It also included being so well rehearsed that the end of each song went straight into the next, with synchronized dance moves that owed as much to the Motown Revue as it did to the church. They were also in the habit of jumping off stage and hambone dancing in the middle of the crowd, on occasion even leading crowds out of the venue and into the street to the beat of the music. Electrifying stuff. And in '68, while they had broken through to the mainstream, they were yet to prove their talent on record, at least until they came out with the album Stand in 1969, just before their iconic appearance at Woodstock. Stand is where they really came into their own, combining the high energy, dance party, funk, soul, R&B psychedelia with topical lyrics that specifically looked at the very American racial dynamics that the band itself existed to confront. 1968 had seen so much unrest come to a head in the country, specifically with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and the American war in Vietnam enjoying its bloodiest year. By which I mean, nobody enjoyed it, obviously. So just as the civil rights and anti-war movements threatened to erupt into violence, here comes a mixed-race, mixed-gender band to give peace and love a shot in the arm, with a perspective that didn't trivialize or dumb down those progressive concerns, and a sound that just made you want to dance, making for a powerful combination. Stand's title track really captured the zeitgeist and also offers a glimpse into the band's future dysfunction in that its irrepressibly funky coda was added by Sly and other available session musicians as he was impatient for the Family Stone to make themselves available at such short notice. but it sets out their stall as a group, a kind of mission statement, and is musically an interesting example of a song, the whole structure of which is about cycling through key changes, all the while transposing the same melody up or down to either create resolve or to create excitement.
Stand, in the end, you'll still be you. One that's done all the things you set out to do. Stand,
Down to F.
there's a cross for you to bear. Things to go through if you're going anywhere.
Down to chorus.
Stand, stand.
And resolving right up there on the E flat. Although, going into the funky coda, it instead goes
Stand, stand
to the C.
Stand. Na 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 na.
Everyday people, and you can make it if you try, also carry on Stan's theme of if everyone loves each other, we can change the world type of thing. Don't call me beep, Whitey. Don't call me Whitey, beep, is more or less exactly what it says on the tin. I want to take you higher, slaps. The whole thing is top notch and considered by many as the band's artistic high point as a musical collective. The Sing a Simple Song riff is one I mistakenly thought was a Jimi Hendrix thing, as he famously quotes it on his live album Band of Gypsies. Hendrix, of course, had the funk in him and so much more, but he didn't get the chance to really make it show, which is why I prefer the straight-ahead funk of Band of Gypsies, especially on account of Buddy Miles' hard-hitting funk drumming. Hendrix was always wary of straying too far from the admittedly incredible screaming psychedelia that brought him to fame, and it's a great shame that two otherwise perhaps like-minded geniuses like Sly and Hendrix, or even Miles Davis, never really had the chance to collaborate and take their concepts of fusion music higher, one way or the other. Hot fun in the summertime, and Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself, again, later famously sampled by Janet Jackson, made for excellent standalone singles in 1969, with the latter popularizing the concept of slap bass. And as a quick note on that, Larry Graham had developed the technique earlier when playing in a two-piece with his pianist/vocalist mother. Firstly, the thumb was to represent the thump of a kick drum on the low strings, with a pluck on the high strings to replicate the pop of a snare drum. This is why he refers to the technique as thumpin' and pluckin' rather than slap bass, which makes sense when you consider slap bass is actually an upright or double bass technique. Whatever you want to call it, on top of all of Sly and the Family Stone's innovation as a group, they introduced this sound to the world with Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself Again. With the single being the band's last release for almost 2 years. This recording hiatus was partly due to heavy demand on the group on the touring circuit, including legendary festival appearances that year at the Harlem Cultural Festival, Newport Jazz, and Woodstock. But it was also because alongside their sudden success came drugs. Lots and lots of lovely drugs. And this fame and the access to the spoils of fame meant that from this point onwards, things gradually became more about Sly than it did the Family Stone. For starters, he relocated the whole band to the center of the music industry in Los Angeles, coincidentally, also the center of the American drug trade. And while I've never literally believed that places can be evil or have a sinister energy of their own, not only did LA bring out the very worst in Sly and everyone else in the band, the fact that they all moved into a mansion formerly owned by Papa John Phillips, one of rock and roll's single darkest, if not the darkest figure, could not have helped things, to put it mildly. Add to that an army of coke-addled hangers-on, including Billy Preston, Miles Davis, Ike Turner, Bobby Womack, and Terry Melcher. Perhaps with the exception of Billy Preston, I couldn't imagine a more inauspicious rogues gallery than that, as far as getting anything productive done. And by now, in 1970, Sly and the Family Stone were all proper superstars. And rather than embrace that opportunity to make music as he had done before, he instead felt stifled by the pressure from the record company to deliver product. And I mean that without judgment, as that kind of pressure must have been relentless and indeed creatively inhibiting, which most likely, in turn, fueled further drug abuse. Also, like Hendrix, around the same time, Sly was feeling the pressure from the white rock movement to act as some kind of figurehead representing all black people, alongside pressure from the Black Panthers on the other side, to sack all of the white people in his band, endorse their movement, and take on a more militant, perhaps divisive political stance. Which was, like with Hendrix, not true to his politics really at all. In response to all of these pressures, Sly's professionalism began to slip. He started being late for gigs, sometimes not showing up at all, with riots breaking out at their shows as a result. And it's worth saying as well that this was at a time where anxiety, which was ultimately the root cause of Sly's problems, not the drugs, which were in fact a symptom, was far less understood as it is now. Drugs became an easy fallback and an antidote to that anxiety, as you might imagine. And from all reports, graduating from abusing prodigious amounts of cocaine to PCP really accelerated Sly's undoing. And you can hear all of this on 1971's There's a Riot Going On, an album that took 2.5 years to make, if that gives you a sense of how much Sly and the Family Stone had slowed down productivity-wise. This is of course nothing compared to modern standards, I might add. Nonetheless, it's quite rightly considered a masterpiece, but on the subject of politics, it's not exactly the topical state of the nation finger-on-the-pulse document that its title or cover would have you believe. While its title was conceived as a literal response to Marvin Gaye's conceptual progressive soul triumph, What's Going On?, the riot it describes is not the one going on out there, but instead the one going on inside the increasingly fevered imagination of Sly Stone himself. I don't need to tell you that it's an extremely important, excellent, and influential record, but its relevance to Fresh is that, having ditched the sunny optimism that had brought Sly and the Family Stone to great fame, Sly would both continue with Riot's inward-looking themes on Fresh, but perhaps more significantly, the production on Riot shares a famously muddy, murky, oppressive atmosphere with Fresh that somehow only enhances the themes of its songs and its low-down and dirty brand of funk. A big part of this is the heavy use of the Maestro Rhythm King MRK2 drum machine, initially used to demo the songs in lieu of a drummer, but eventually becoming key to the arrangements of the songs alongside actual acoustic drums. But moreover, it was Sly's drug-fueled perfectionism that caused him to record and re-record parts over and over again that mostly contributes to the album's sound, with analog tape famously degrading the more you record and wipe. This is not the same band that had played together so harmoniously as a unit on the band's first 4 albums. Of Riot's 3 singles, Family Affair is also rightly considered an absolute classic, and the last and by far the biggest of the band's 3 #1 hits in their career. It was also key to crossing Sly and the Family Stone back over to black radio, and his laid-back, coke-throttled voice again could not do more to demonstrate to us that this is no longer the man who delivered us Damned way back in '69. It's worth noting as well just how enormously influential Riot was on the hip-hop music of the coming decades. Critically, Riot was the point where critics stopped going on about Sly and the Family Stone's integrationist positivity and instead started calling him a 2-bit gangster, a jumped-up pimp with too much fame, too much money, and too many drugs. While some of that was true, this is ultimately just white liberals hating on a black man who is no longer, whether for political reasons or personal ones, making white liberals feel good about the state of the world and the state of America in 1971. But personal politics within the band were proving fractious, hardly surprising considering how much of Riot is rumoured to be recorded by Sly and Sly alone. Drummer Greg Errico being the first to leave the group just after its release, and Larry Graham's exit from the band in 1972 really signalled a major change, particularly in relation to Sly's increasing paranoia and habit of burning bridges with just about everyone. You see, the thing about drugs is that they are profoundly Moorish. Cocaine is famously Moorish. in that if you had the money to do so and were otherwise famous and successful enough to effectively, if not literally, live a life without consequences or fairly close to it, you would never stop taking cocaine and PCP and alcohol and anything and everything else that just kept the party going. And by the time you have realized that this is either killing you or killing your career or your creativity or your personal life, it is already too late. Your life then becomes an endless circle, a repeat of the same sordid scene again and again, until first your band, then your family, then your future all walk out on you. But until that happens, what most people don't realize is that for drug addicts, life is quite simple and, in a sense, easy. You know what you want, what you need, and how to get it. And this blinds drug addicts to the squalor, drama, or heartache that so often comes alongside addiction. Those things are visible only to the people around the addict and not the addict themselves. I have certainly heard it said that if you are lucky, addiction comes alongside or is perhaps a byproduct of wealth and fame, as it did for Sly Stone. You exist inside a bubble that can make people feel like the sun shines on their shoulders. Other people can do the grubby stuff, the sleaziness of actually scoring drugs and dealing with underworld dodgy characters. And if you're always high and you never have to come down, what's the problem? That life is of course unsustainable, as Sly's story goes on to prove, if it hasn't already by 1973. But what it does do in the context of Fresh is infect the music in terms of composition as well as production. Fresh by Sly and the Family Stone is anything but fresh. It's not just the sound of someone who never sleeps and is therefore physically and mentally, by definition, not fresh. It's also an expression from a musical genius in the absolute throes of addiction. The lyrics of multiple tracks on this record make this clear, including instances where he is directly addressing his wife, saying he is who he is and has no intention of changing, and other times where he is testifying to God about how he wouldn't do a single thing differently if he had his time all over again. He loves being addicted to drugs. He loves his lifestyle. He can't get enough of it. In fact, he's kind of bragging about it. And that is why we get this incredibly focused, single-minded record. Of course, because addicts are dedicated to what they are doing by their very nature, and music in this case goes hand in hand with that. Another album like this is of course David Bowie's Station to Station, one commonly cited as his very best effort, and a record he later said he literally could not remember making. Such was his fondness for cocaine at the time. I would say he sounds even more throttled on its predecessor, Young Americans, but on Station to Station, he's actually gone beyond just being fueled by drugs to becoming possessed by them, and actually leaning into the darkness. But Sly is in a similar funk here. Not only does his voice sound torched, but the instruments are lacking clarity in the mix, and much like on There's a Riot Going On, admittedly to a lesser degree than on that record, the mix is murky and dry sounding in a way that comes over as sleazy and oppressive, claustrophobic even. And if this wasn't a funk record, even if it's for the most part a half-time and not particularly danceable one, it would make for one depressing, cokey slog. But even with Sly nearing his lowest ebb, he's still an incredible, genius musician before he is a drug addict, and his musical soul is still the one we're hearing on this album. And by all accounts, like again with Riot, it's pretty unclear just how much of the playing on Fresh is Sly alone. Such was his genius and compulsive perfectionism. But what is clear is how far Sly and the Family Stone have come in the 2.5 years since Stand in 1969. What once was a big brassy show band singing inclusive songs about the brave new world that's going to come, they are now a one-man show, sounding suddenly very small, with songs that for the most part quite literally reflect his decadent lifestyle. Politically, having seen the top of the mountain at Woodstock, it's quite terrifying how far Sly has gone in the other direction. Of course, that's not in a right-wing direction, obviously, but interestingly, he didn't move further to the left either, into the black militancy that perhaps many might have expected or wanted of him. Instead, Sly's outlook has become bleakly nihilistic, inward and despondent maybe, in the only way it can once you've achieved everything you've set out to achieve. For a man considered a totem of colourlessness in his embrace of black and white music, as well as black and white musicians, on top of a sense of genderlessness in his flamboyant personal androgyny and inclusion of female perspectives in his art, Fresh could not be more self-possessed. An album about not what it's like to be any black man, but instead what it's like to be this black man, Sly Stone. So to that end, perhaps slightly more than half of Fresh is made up of pleasingly monotonous funk grooves that don't tend to take giant steps harmonically or structurally in and of themselves, which very much puts Fresh in the vibes record category, the kind of album you can put on at a party and enjoy passively just as much as you might do through active listening. It's interesting how often songs with a similar mood or feel are sequentially placed back to back on this album with less emphasis on stylistic variety, as if Sly wants you to sink into the groove with him and stay there. It's obviously funky, but for the most part, very low-key across the board. Fresh's biggest moments are instead, for the most part, the result of detailed arrangements, some played by the band, with others the result of decisions made during the album's mixing stage. And some insight has been provided on this through the apparent accidental release of a bunch of the record's alternate mixes by Sony Music in 1991. And what they show is that Sly recorded most, if not all of these songs, with entirely different arrangements and mixes simultaneously. And the effect this has on the record is in the amount of detail heard on it, as if he's had a guitar or a trumpet or an organ stab playing the same motif every bar, but in the mixing stage he's pulled them all out except for once every 2 or 4 or 6 bars. So you never get too used to the same sound occurring in the same place or in the same space that your brain comes to expect it. As if everything in the arrangement is on some kind of loop and he's just pulling the faders up and down at very specific moments, maybe, for example, even taking the drums out entirely in favour of the Rhythm King drum machine. And with all this, only Sly, the mad genius, can actually see or hear the big picture and how this enormous dark funk puzzle fits together. The mix becomes the performance. And from a technical perspective, this is pretty out there for 1973 when you consider this is obviously recorded, edited and mixed to tape, rather than with the click of a computer mouse. The presence of the Rhythm King would have contributed to this as well, perhaps by accident, as the drum machine's set tempo means that the tracks all effectively rigidly adhere to a grid, making editing easier and making Fresh more in common with sample-based dance and electronic music of today, more than anything else really being recorded just about anywhere in 1973. And this at least partial, modular approach only builds on top of Sly and the Family Stone's existing legacy as one of the most sampled bands ever, not just through the reappropriation of so many of their iconic drum breaks, but also baked into Sly's songwriting and production. In the hip-hop of the following decade, the technique of isolating and looping back small sections of a track, usually alongside drastic changes in tempo, known as chopped and screwed, was knowingly postmodern in that it acknowledges the work that it is based on thematically and builds on the original conceit. And this is something Sly had been doing throughout the Family Stone's career. 1969's Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself Again being a prime example that explicitly references several of the band's earlier hits in the lyrics. The references to Sly himself and the specific members of the band heard in 1967's Dance to the Music is also reflected in the kind of confidence and assertive machismo later associated with rap and hip-hop. Both of these self-referential forms are present throughout the lyrics on Fresh, with some songs serving as bitterly ironic rehashings of Sly and the Family Stone's earlier songs, and oftentimes defiant yet broken confessionals from Sly himself. It also underlines again just how far he and they had come since 1969. Music production had come a long way in this time as well, certainly in a way that favours the rhythm section heavy nature of funk music as a genre, perhaps only achieved comparatively by accident in the primitive studios of the 60s. While I think he's over-egging the pudding just a little bit, Brian Eno has notably pointed to Fresh specifically as representing a turning point in the way records have been mixed historically, with an emphasis on bass and drums. Whether that's fair to say or not, a record like Fresh was indeed only made possible by the shifting attitudes to record making, again in the mixing stage, not because of advancements in technology, or solely advancements in technology, I should say, but simply through ingenuity. In the 60s, which, let's remember, only ended 4 years prior to this album, mixing engineers didn't really exist. A producer, which nowadays is a catch-all term for someone who may also be an album's mixing engineer, its recording engineer, or even all of these or none of these things at all. Back then was someone who stood at the back of the room, smoking, usually with very little understanding or regard for the technicalities of record making. Engineers would record a band, a group, or a singer, and 9 times out of 10, records sounded the way they did because that's just how those musicians sounded playing in that room with those instruments and those microphones. Sly and the Family Stone's first 4 albums are largely recorded in this manner. By 73, musicians had very much cottoned on to how exacting you can be in a recording studio if you have the time. So now that every single thing can be recorded separately and controlled, we now have a mixing engineer whose sole job it is to think about how each and every sound can exist in an aural space in terms of infinite degrees of left to center to right positioning, but also with each instrument owning a specific sonic frequency in the mix. And as much as the technology has changed since then, those principles have not. It's incredible to think that the vast majority of recording and mixing techniques were pioneered in what was ultimately not much more than a decade or so. The biggest difference is that what once required a multi-room studio with banks and banks of expensive hardware and outboard gear can now fit inside of a single laptop or even a phone. But the reason this was possible then, of course, and something that I come back to time and time again, was there was just so much money in the industry at this time. And thank God that this meant that a genius like Sly Stone was afforded the opportunity to spend an ungodly number of hours in a studio making this music. It's a miracle. Fresh wastes very little time buttering us up with its opening track, In Time. The Rhythm King is immediately there from the get-go, and Andy Newmark's stop-start drum solo across an uneven 6 bars is discombobulating in its measured unpredictability. But once the organ and the spidery and slightly dissonant guitar riff start the song's introduction proper, we are at least temporarily on more solid ground. Fairly dissonant in and of itself, but when taken with the chords underneath it, D minor, C, and F, that's really quite weird. And after this point, all bets are off at the beginning of verse 1, sending us straight into a heavily syncopated, funky nightmare. We are just bombarded with musical information here. Yet so tightly arranged the parts are that nothing overly distracts from Sly's vocal over the top, launching into his part confession, part humble brag, part mission statement. The first line, "There's a Mickey in the tasting of disaster," which is to say there is something incapacitating and intoxicating about things going badly. And what's going badly? His own drug use, that's what. But he's not even speaking there from a position of shame. He goes on to talk about how much he's switched from Coke to Pep, an excellent pun, substituting Coke and Pepsi for cocaine and amphetamines, and pointing his finger at those who can't keep up with them. If anything, he's bragging about how he can get things done, not just in spite of the non-stop high life, but because of it. He even name-checks Bobby Womack's older brother, Harry Hippie, for his procrastinator, Nathan, subsequently taking a darker significance when Harry Womack was murdered the year after this came out, following a domestic argument with his girlfriend. But Sly has little sympathy for those quitters and deserters, as he calls them. He's saying there is method in his madness, which is borne out by the song's incredible arrangement. In Time is also a fitting name for this track in that playing any of the instrumental parts in time with the track is extraordinarily difficult, considering how complex its rhythm is. And while, of course, you can count the song in a conventional 4/4, almost none of the individual instruments are exactly playing it straight in that way. In fact, the Rhythm King drum machine is the only constant anchor throughout that we have to indicate to the band, let alone the listener, where we're at in the song. The arrangement has been very deliberately and carefully orchestrated so that each part, which in isolation might be only a stab per bar in a very specific place, like it is with the organ part or the guitar, so that no instruments are stepping on any other's toes, and combined with each instrument's location in the left-right mix means that your attention is constantly darting around across the stereo picture to hear the guitar and organ and the horns play their miniature motifs, while the rhythm section itself sits naturally right down the middle. Breaking up a melody or rhythm between different players or instruments is known as hocketing in traditional arranging. But here it is so microscopically precise, it's almost terrifyingly complicated, yet cohesive when taken as a whole. I can't imagine how Sly did this without the use of modern computers, frankly. By itself, the drum part in the verse makes my brain hurt, so I won't try and explain that. But it would seem that it follows the bass rather than the other way around, which would be typically how a rhythm section would work. The bass guitar is basically doing variations on this 4-bar measure. 3, 4. It's simultaneously funky as hell, but seemingly only danceable if you have 8 limbs. Pure deconstructed funk. There's a drum break and a temporary key change for the song's bridge before we return back to the original key of F. Special mention also goes, as it will time and time again on Fresh, to Sly's vocal. Especially towards the end of the track, he's scatting, he's howling, he's screaming and he's shrieking. Such incredible control from a man so apparently out of control. As an album opener, it could not stand as a greater contrast to something like Stand. He has gone from broadcasting his message of positivity to the whole world to now, where he is no longer looking outwardly whatsoever, and is indeed actually embracing the darkness within. This is going to be a bumpy ride. The first single released from Fresh and Sly and the Family Stone's final appearance in either the top 20 pop or R&B charts. On the subject of Sly's voice, he sounds absolutely torched on If You Want Me to Stay, and despite his all-round raspiness, is capable of some incredible control, smoothness, and delicacy in the delivery of this deceptively short and simple song. And while its low-key and intimate style of funk risks lulling the listener into thinking this is some kind of love song, or at the very least some kind of musical expression of contrition or apology, instead it becomes increasingly apparent that If You Want Me to Stay instead represents a rather vicious lashing out at his lover. His incredible growling melisma, so often deployed near the beginning of the song's vocal phrases, make him sound like a caged animal, itching to jump out and bite.
Count the days I'm gone, forgetting reaching me by phone, 'cause I promise I'll be gone for a while.
Supposedly with its origins in a genuine apology from Sly following an argument with his wife-to-be, Kathy Silver, in the lyrics of the song he basically continues the theme of the album's previous track, explaining that he's never going to change and his lover is the one that needs to adapt to him and not the other way around. So worked into a frenzy by his righteousness, the song, which is simply made up of a very satisfying set of chords across 4 bars on repeat more or less forever, is broken up only when he seemingly forgets to continue the 5th verse, and we're treated to what sounds like an improvised piano solo before he can bring himself to return to the song's structure. The fact that the song itself kind of peters out instrument by instrument instead of fading out, which would of course be the more pop thing to do, is of course super cool. But moreover adds weight to the suggestion that Sly himself is quite possibly playing every instrument, or almost every instrument on this track. Once again, the Rhythm King keeps time and is the first sound heard on the track. But the mix is otherwise very bass forward, and all of the other instruments are effectively just following the bass part. And the jury is still out on whether the bass was played by Rusty Allen or Sly himself. Either way, it's defined not by Larry Graham's distinctive slapping and popping style, but to my ears is played using pinch harmonics or something close to it. Normally, a guitar player's technique and a style that really makes it pop out of the mix. The first thing that jumps out at me in Let Me Have It All is the surprising lack of the Rhythm King drum machine in its opening bars. And moreover, the mix of the song, or better yet, the sort of sonic image of it to my ears is something of an inversion of what we're used to. The vocal is front and center as usual, with the rhythm section far more buried than usual. And the very ghostly, screaming lead guitar sounds as if it was recorded and then wiped, but heard residually through the other instruments' channels, possibly by accident, possibly by design. But the song itself is comparatively simplistic and begins a run of songs on Fresh that are very much single-note grooves. And I mean single note, not as in they use only one note, of course, but they are kind of repeating a central motif rather than being song-like and necessarily structured. To that end, lyrically, it's simply about the moorishness of the high life, one way or another, Sly demonstrating his seemingly infinite appetite for all things. It really couldn't be simpler. Let me have it all. Some people consider it a late career thematic rehashing of I Want to Take You Higher from Stand, and in many ways it is, although it is suitably infinitely sleazier than that comparatively bright and sunny tune. Sly has come a long way since '69, and while he has gone higher, it's only in one sense of the word, in all fairness. As I say, the vocals are the main focus, including some incredible call and response from Sister Rose and female vocal group Little Sister, led by Vet Stone, the fourth and final Stewart sibling to perform and record with Sly and the Family Stone. It also apparently features Bobby Womack on wah-wah guitar, had some very tasteful horn parts and breakdowns similarly to the previous track on Fresh, while also fading out at the end this time. As a final note on this one, the sheer arrogance of Mick Hucknall and Simply Red famously doing a cover of it and barely changing the arrangement. The implication being that he has even a skerrick of an inch of an iota of Sly's charisma or vocal talent. And while Mick Hucknall is plenty talented, Sly Stone, he is not. You simply cannot step up to the king in this way and expect to get away with it. Sorry, Mick. Here on Frisky, we go yet further into the murky funk of Fresh, to the point where this electric piano-led track sounds like it was recorded underwater, the drums especially. And it's even less of a song than Let Me Have It All. It's a half-spoken, half-sung invitation into Sly's bedroom for a bit of frisky, drug-fueled action. Put a little tickle on the Joneses' head, turn off the lights and go to bed. Have you ever stopped a rainbow? I don't think so, at least. To the Fog and Frisky afternoon feast. In fact, the chords in the main body of the song, or the verse, if you could call it that, is not a million miles away from If You Want Me to Stay.
I'll be down when you're gone. Call me up on the telephone. Little on, name inside tune. Go all the way down.
Can't really play much more than that, but it's just such a cool part. Prince and his Sign of the Times era owes a lot to this track, specifically in relation to Sly's vocal delivery. And while slight, it represents an innovative, subtle, and somewhat seductively claustrophobic approach to funk that couldn't be further away from the brassy, technicolor exuberance of Sly and the Family Stone in the late 60s. Thankful and Thoughtful is far more substantial as a composition, if still very much of a piece with the previous two tracks on Fresh, vibe-wise. Probably because the subject of the song is comparatively serious. In the lyric, Sly is letting us know that he knows just how close to the edge he is skating considering his lifestyle. Sunday morning, I forgot my prayer. I should have been happy, I'll still be there. Something could have come and taken me away, but the main man felt still, should be here another day. Existing at the very heights of excess, Sly is almost surprised to wake up alive each day, and fundamentally being a deeply religious man, he acknowledges this is a sign of divine intervention, and his continued existence an expression of God's will. And it recalls and in many ways references the band's earlier work, particularly Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself Again, in that he's very big on showing his gratitude and reverence to a higher power that is the theme of so much religious music, of course, and reflected in his gospel vocal affectations that he no doubt first heard and performed in the church as a child. Thankful and Thoughtful is very much like a prayer. But perhaps rather than view any near-death experience he has had, be it from a potential drug overdose or threats of violence as a consequence of having to mix with the criminal underworld to procure drugs and sustain his habit, the song could be interpreted less as a warning sign, but instead another brag about how indestructible and untouchable he is at this point in his life. God has decided that Sly will live, and Sly is not wrong to think that. And even if by 73 Sly and the Family Stone had well and truly burned their bridges as a result of being so unreliable and unprofessional as a live act, they are still selling records by the ton, and that is down almost entirely to Sly alone rather than the collective effort of the band. Therefore, as far as he's concerned, why change tack now? God is clearly on side. And despite its more substantial lyric, it's one of the more minimalistic tracks on Fresh musically, with the Rhythm King providing the main backbeat throughout yet again, the gentle pad of Sly's electric piano, and as ever, the choice deployment of horns to punctuate moments throughout the song, especially in the chorus. With Sly's lead vocal taking something of a back seat, it's instead the bass guitar and backing vocals that make up the meat and potatoes on this one. So for the bass part, instead of going as you might expect it to do, it instead second guesses the listener and does this. Which, taken with the backing vocals in the chorus, sounds like this. Thankful. Eventually we get the ubiquitous wah-wah guitar playing a fairly busy part, and the song gradually builds in intensity, and when Andy Newmark's similarly accented parts on the snare and hi-hat do appear, they are deliberately mixed to sound indistinguishable from the also ubiquitous Rhythm King drum machine. Ending with a fade-out, Thankful and Thoughtful brings side one of Fresh to a close and completes the album's run of mid-tempo, low-key funk grooves that makes Fresh such a stoned 2 a.m., the needle broke off in my arm kind of experience. And while Rusty Allen is an excellent bass guitarist and a worthy successor to the great Larry Graham, Sly cannot help but open side 2 of Fresh with a stunning bass guitar showcase of his own. Such is his extraordinary multi-instrumental talent. And it's not even about playing a lot of notes, it's about a feel that he has for the music, as ever. While I can't be sure if it's Sly himself or brother Freddie singing different sections of this song, it otherwise has very few lyrics. If anything, it's yet another declaration that he wouldn't live his life any differently from how he is doing it now, should he have had the chance to start again. But here, rather than expressing that through the lyrics, it's instead through this bonkers funk workout that gives each section of the band the opportunity to show off. My favourite part is where the horns go. Like the rhythm section is kind of inverting itself somehow. Just like In Time, it's in a sense perfectly danceable, but you have to have like 9 limbs to do it. At times it's like math funk or something. All in all, an incredible track to open side 2. Sly apparently also covers the bass duties on I Don't Know, brackets, Satisfaction, close brackets. In addition to providing a showcase for Rose Stone and Little Sister in the song's repeated refrain. All we need is little action, if it's only but a fraction. Lyrically, it's in many ways an answer song to the Rolling Stones' similarly titled 1965 hit Satisfaction. Whereas that song spoke to the struggle for a liberal identity against the everyday forces of consumerism and increased commercialization, Sly is taking that concept further and yet simultaneously in 1973, harking back to the Woodstock generation's heyday, as well as Sly and the Family Stones, of course, in celebrating the power of collectivism in the fight against racial inequality, which is quite unusual in Sly's music of this period. So as a broadly activist-y song, for this reason it sticks out as something of a throwback to an earlier time, and certainly stands alone on Fresh in this way. While the music might more closely invoke There's a Riot Going On, thematically at least, lyrically it further elaborates on, or instead evolves, the utopian conceit of songs like Stand or Everyday People in favour of another flavour of idealism, that of militaristic black power radicalism that in many ways subsumed so much of the hippie movement, or at least the part of it that didn't just become lawyers and doctors. Or at least I think it's fair to say the language is coded far more in this way than the let's just hold hands and get along sentiment of Sly in '69. I see abuse, what's the use? Time must let my people loose. Much to learn, a place to turn, when there's nothing else to burn. So given that, and alongside this track's place on an album that is otherwise looking very much inward, examining the self, or Sly's self specifically, the song perhaps represents a political last gasp in a way. Musically, it's incredible, as ever, and absolutely sells the message. But by 1973, I'm not sure I believe Sly's commitment to the cause anymore, whatever it might be. Sly and the Family Stone's very career arc follows the same trajectory as the hippie movement, in that what started as collectivism and solidarity ends as the 80s dawns with material self-interest, a culture of greed, and a liberal obsession with personal identity. And while success and the drugs that came alongside success pulled Sly down a little faster than everyone else, perhaps quite naturally, it at least helped to create this incredible funk. I also quite like how in the song's fade you hear Sly tell his tape operator to go back, presumably for yet another take. Just one of the many tiny moments on Fresh where he lets you see how the sausage is made. Keep on Dancin', like its predecessor, also calls back to an earlier style of song that first brought the band to fame, specifically Dance to the Music. This being a deliberate nod to it, as Sly is never shy about being directly self-referential. What perhaps makes it darkly amusing is that this instruction to keep on dancing is being delivered through a snowstorm of cocaine. Sly sounds absolutely throttled here, issuing his command to take the floor through a clenched jaw and gritted teeth. He even sings the line, "I'd get snowed in if I could," suggesting he is perfectly aware how far, or in many ways how low, he and the band have come since the carefree fun of Dance to the Music 5 years earlier. And on a funk album full of super funky songs that can't really be danced to, at least in a conventional sense, it's grimly ironic that its very least danceable track is called Keep on Dancin'. Not for the first or last time that Sly would effectively rehash an old concept, but in this place and time carries a totally different meaning. I don't think he's trying to piggyback on his previous success by any means. I think what he is doing here, and the numerous other times he calls back to his own work, is taking up on the tradition of being self-referential previously associated with artists like Bo Diddley, who wrote themselves into their songs. Obviously, a lot of people have done this throughout the years, but I think it's fair to say that the hip-hop genre is synonymous with name-dropping and self-aggrandizement. And of course, this is just one of the many things that Sly and the Family Stone passed down to the next generation. And speaking of wringing pathos out of something that has gone before, next up we have Será. Now, despite Sly and the Family Stone essentially starting out as a top 20 good time party band, this song, written by Jay Livingston and Ray Evans and made famous by Doris Day in the 1956 film The Man Who Knew Too Much, is in fact the only cover song in Sly and the Family Stone's entire canon, interestingly enough. Why? Well, the prevailing theory is that in the late 60s, Sly Stone had an affair with Doris Day herself, acquainted as she and Sly were via her producer scumbag son, Terry Melcher. Whether or not there's truth in that, I can certainly imagine Sly playfully striking this one up around the piano after a nose beer or two. And you can certainly imagine this one at the end of a long night, the party is over, and there's nothing left to do but stare at the floor and think about what you've done, sort of thing. But considering also how unapologetic Sly has demonstrated himself to be over the course of Fresh, whatever will be is certainly a believable mantra for a heavy drug user who believes that it's only because of God's will that he wakes up alive each and every day. Who knows? Maybe he's right. And despite the song's rather corny origins, I do love the coked out interpretation here, just dripping with a slow world weariness. Notable also is its 6/8 time signature, while technically danceable in itself, certainly puts it out of place on an otherwise heavy funk record. Larry Graham plays bass on this track and the next, suggesting it was recorded perhaps years previously. The otherwise organ-led arrangement does include the ubiquitous Rhythm King, so that would date its recording, were it all tracked at once, which it almost definitely wasn't. Back in 1970, perhaps at the earliest. While Rose's vocals are all over most of the band's tracks, here she takes a rare lead vocal, in the verses at least. And it speaks to Sly's gospel music lineage as well, that while the song's chords are recognisable as Que Sera Serás, his chosen melody, especially in the chorus, is effectively his own.
Que sera, sera.
can't help but put his own chords in there as well.
The future's not ours to see. Well, 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 well. Que sera, que sera, que sera.
Do on the bass. Very jazzy, very cool. For a song that nobody really likes, Sly sure makes it sound bloody good to me. With Que Sera, Será and If It Were Left Up to Me being songs recorded before, perhaps well before, 1973, might suggest their inclusion on Fresh is merely to pad out the record. The quality of these tracks definitely make up for that, even if it is true. This track in particular sounds like an infinitely younger, more optimistic incarnation of Sly and the Family Stone, because basically, that's exactly what it is. Left off their 1968 album, Life, If It Were Left Up to Me is very much of its time. For starters, a byproduct of being recorded earlier is that the production is far clearer and Larry Graham's bass doesn't sound like it's underwater. An enjoyable, if slight, song, the lyric shares the broad positivity of much of the band's earlier work and is musically fairly simple and repetitive, at least as far as it can be within its meagre 2 minutes. Sequencing-wise, it's interesting that we are offered a glimpse of the band's idealistic past here just prior to the album's conclusion, bringing Fresh's otherwise squalid and sleazy present-day atmosphere into stark contrast. It's like saying, here, this is what you could have had, although the older version of the band heard here doesn't seem at all possible in 1973 for reasons both within and beyond their own control. Like so much of the material on There's a Riot Going On, this track lets you think, through pretty much its title only, that it's some kind of gritty political commentary, when the lyrics are actually little more than a handful of repetitive, mostly meaningless lines. It certainly could be about teenage pregnancy and the cycles of poverty that it engenders, but it could just as easily be read as a celebration of the circle of life. We're all born babies, only to grow up and make more babies. Simple. But that's not to say the song is underwhelming in any way. Instead, as a grand statement to pull together the album's murky, postmodern threads, it's more of a musical showcase for this incredible band Sly has backing him. And while it's sad that they are relegated to Sly's backing band here on Fresh more than ever, it's a reminder of how powerful they can be when the family stands as one. I'm going to surprise you here and say that it's incredibly funky. But what I hear on this track more than any other on Fresh is the underhood workings of this music. As we know, Sly had by 1973 for years been in the habit of recording tracks, deleting tracks, and re-recording tracks in an endless, obsessive, perfectionist cycle. This partly explains the murky production on Fresh and Riot, but on this track in particular, you can hear the ghosts of previous horn parts, most prominently, that have been clearly taken out and replaced since first recording. In addition to that, and the knowledge that Sly would go on to remix this album endlessly also, you can really hear on Babies Makin' Babies how he is very much bringing elements of the band in and out of the mix very deliberately. And what we're hearing may bear very little resemblance to what the band may have been hearing in the room at the time of recording, if any of them were even recorded together at all anyway. It reminds me of the title track on Funkadelic's Maggot Brain, where George Clinton famously mixed everything but the guitars out of a full band performance, giving additional prominence to Eddie Hazel's screaming guitar solo in isolation. On Babies Makin' Babies, the only through part that I can hear is the guitar that goes... But as soon as it appears, it disappears again, so it's hard to point to any single musical anchor in this track beyond that I can hear. It has some great bass playing as ever, and really wraps up Fresh with a tight, funky jam, suitable for an album which for the most part is a succession of vibes, a series of grooves you can use if you choose. It's worth saying as well that the extended alternative mix does a lot to explain Miles Davis's infatuation with Sly and the Family Stone. So unlike the majority of the albums in my Lost Masterpieces series, Fresh was for the most part lauded by the critics at the time and sold perfectly well, reaching number 7 on the US pop album charts and number 1 on the soul album charts in 1973. I think it's fair to say, however, that classic rock culture has largely forgotten it, preferring the comforting liberal idealism of Stand as opposed to Fresh's weird, druggy insularity. That market was instead sewn up in the minds of Rolling Stone readers by There's a Riot Going On, helped in no small part by its trendy surface-level political themes, which I don't think it really has, in all fairness. Of course, Riot is a masterpiece, but it's not controversial to suggest that it unfairly overshadows Fresh. Fresh is, of course, a perhaps uncomfortable reminder that this is basically Sly and the Family Stone's last stand, as their downward slide, while not as drastic as it's commonly thought of, definitely started after this point, and it certainly represents the beginning of the end for Sly and the Family Stone, who technically limped on for another decade, but continued as a band really in name only. Famously, Fresh's follow-up Small Talk was released the following year, coinciding with Sly's public marriage to Kathy Silver as part of a concert at Madison Square Garden. Their marriage lasted only 6 months, but resulted in the birth of his only son, Sylvester Jr. He later on also fathered a daughter, Sylviette, with bandmate Cynthia Robinson. In 1975, the band more or less disintegrated, following a series of disastrous and poorly attended gigs at New York's Radio City Music Hall, with Sly releasing his first solo album the same year. Sly and the Family Stone technically continued as more or less a Sly Stone solo project at the same time, with diminishing returns, releasing 3 more underwhelming albums before their, let's say, legal dissolution in 1983. Unsurprisingly, the 40 or so subsequent years until Sly's 2025 death were made up of failed comebacks, business and management difficulties, and a whole lot of drugs. He spent most of the 80s doing crack cocaine with George Clinton and moving in and out of jail or rehab and back again. He also made a notable surprise appearance at Sly and the Family Stone's 1993 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame acceptance ceremony, and appeared sporadically, and not to break a habit of a lifetime, usually late, on stage with various incarnations of a revived Family Stone band in his final years. Of course, it's nothing short of a miracle that the man made it to the ripe old age of 82 considering his lifestyle. And while this will certainly make for an unpopular opinion, the fact that he did so kind of validates a lot of his self-destructive behaviour in a sense. I don't mean to play down the misery that his addictions no doubt caused his friends and family, but such is the price of flying so very, very high. Jimmy Page, another rock legend who everyone thought was going to die in the mid-70s, also talks about his heroin problem in a similar way. While it eventually also hampered his personal professionalism, which he doesn't exactly cop to in all fairness, his heroin use wasn't actually what finished Led Zeppelin, and at least for a time provided, or at very least enhanced, his creative muse. And the music industry of the 70s, in all of its messed up glory, accommodated that in a way that would be unthinkable now in the music industry. So I don't look at Sly Stone as a burnout, an example of squandered talent. He made lots and lots of incredible music, more than most people, and drugs, at least in part, fueled that creativity before it destroyed it, which is something. And in the lyrics of Fresh, I think he's kind of right to be defiant and even petulant about it to a degree, because God clearly wanted him to live. And he did live. For ages. Another comparison might be Jimi Hendrix, the greatest rock star ever to live. Like Sly, he brought his casual swagger and technical flash to an ostensibly white medium and did it better than anyone else. But the weight of it killed Hendrix in only 4 years. And while I've always considered the glorification of the rock and roll lifestyle, for the most part confected and obviously immature, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that some people, perhaps 1 in a million, are just born to party hard. And while Hendrix was not, the evidence would suggest that Sly was one of them. But thankfully, Sly's legacy is not that. It's this. And it's this. And all the other records he made that made people move. And all the records that other people made from sampling him in order to make people move. From Public Enemy, De La Soul, the Beastie Boys, Kendrick Lamar, and countless others. Sly's pioneering work provided the building blocks for the genres of jazz fusion, funk, and hip-hop, and runs through the works of icons like Michael Jackson and Prince, in fact, especially Prince with his mixed-race, mixed-gender band. And to the theme of inclusion, Sly himself is an interesting, contradictory symbol of the hippie movement, something that, as I say, began as collectivism and ended up completely self-absorbed and self-serving. The liberal dream personified. Peace and love turned to drugs and darkness. which is what makes Fresh a musical misnomer if I ever heard one. Indeed, not Sly and the Family Stone's high point as a band necessarily, but instead was perhaps a creative peak for the man known as Sylvester Stewart, from then on in a race with himself towards his lowest ebb. Fresh is that moment when the party is emptying out and we're no longer having fun, even if we're pretending through a coke-frozen grimace that we are. And it's partly believable in this way, because it and Sly and the Family Stone, as a group, encapsulates a seductive, futuristic post-race vision, a longing for a better world where we can just party and get along and get down to the groove. And despite this, Fresh is also deeply self-aware, painfully conscious of how paper-thin and fleeting the idealism of the Woodstock Nation truly was. Scratch a hippie and a narcissist, or maybe even an addict, bleeds. But what turns us into addicts? Be it drugs or sex or alcohol or pornography or TV or social media or whatever else. It's the desire to escape, the need to block out the bad and feel only the good. The more I habitually doom scroll, lying awake at night despairing about managed decline, shrinking populations, the reversal of our hard-won rights, the broken social contract, war in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, Trump, China, terrorism, AI, ecological degradation, and climate change, the greater I feel the pull of escapism in one form or another. This reality is the new normal, and the old one is quite simply never coming back. If There's a Riot Going On is at least nominally a reaction to the political crises of the early 1970s, Fresh more reflects the polycrises of today, and the only remaining available reaction to it that is left. The final stage of grief, acceptance. Medicated, decadent, watching the world burn through stoned eyes. To invoke Leonardo DiCaprio's character in Wolf of Wall Street, get the lewds, I will not die sober. And I feel bad for young people today, because their eyes are more open and sober, weirdly, than ever. I'm at least old enough to remember, basically before the global financial crash of 2008, that there was once such a thing called optimism. And as each day goes by, I'm getting more and more adjusted to what's ahead in this century, as well as reflecting positively on all the good things that we had in the past and still have today, before they're gone. And music, especially the wild, weird, and wonderful music made by people with too much money and oftentimes too many drugs, is all nowadays at our very fingertips. And not just the music made today, but the music made by anyone, ever, who has been able to record it in one way or the other. And that, despite everything, is more than enough reason to be thankful and thoughtful that God or Sly or whoever is up there calling the shots has decided that we should be alive right now in this very moment.